There is a moment in the broadcast that the palace did not catch in time to stop. Catherine is sitting in front of a camera, composed the way she always is, speaking the way she has been trained to speak, and then something crosses her face that this country has never seen there before. Not grief, not exhaustion. Something closer to the look a person gets when a truth they have been carrying alone for a very long time suddenly becomes impossible to carry quietly. She holds it for about 3 seconds and then she pulls herself back. But the camera was already there. And the reason it happened, the actual reason underneath all of it, is 11 words spoken by an 11-year-old girl in a room that was supposed to be private. Charlotte said them without understanding the full weight of what she was releasing, and she released something that has been building in that family for over 2 decades. We are going to get to those 11 words, but if I give them to you now, they are just words. You will hear them the way Catherine heard them, sitting on the floor of a private sitting room with her daughter's face 6 inches from hers, understanding in real time that her child had been watching something for years that nobody had ever sat down and explained to her, and that she had drawn her own conclusions anyway, because 11-year-olds always do. I am Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family, the records, the inquiry documents, the reporting that got buried before anybody finished asking questions. And what you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them, not a palace press release. The last thing in this story is not a statement, and it is not a confrontation. It is a mother sitting in a car on the way back from a live broadcast, looking out of a window, saying nothing at all. And when you understand what brought her to that window, the silence is the loudest thing in this entire story. So let me tell you exactly what happened. You have to understand what Catherine's composure actually is before you can understand what it means when it breaks. Because it is not a personality trait. It is not something she was born with or stumbled into. It is a structure, a deliberate load-bearing wall that she has been building and reinforcing for over a decade, brick by careful brick, in full view of a country that has been watching her build it and largely mistaken the construction for the person. She arrived into this family as a young woman from a background that was comfortable but not royal, which meant she had none of the inherited armor and all of the inherited expectation. She had to learn the composure the way you learn a foreign language as an adult, which is to say imperfectly and with enormous effort and in full awareness that every mistake is going to be noticed by somebody. And she did not make many mistakes. She made so few over such a sustained period that the country eventually stopped treating the composure as an achievement and started treating it as a given, as though Catherine simply was this way, as though the stillness came naturally. It does not come naturally. It never did. The people who have worked closely with her over the years will tell you the same thing if you ask them carefully enough. The composure is real, but it is maintained the way a high-wire act is maintained, through constant, invisible adjustment, through 100 small decisions made every hour about what to show and what to absorb and what to file away for later when there is nobody watching. She does not suppress things. She delays them. She takes the things that would break a normal person's face in public, and she finds a drawer for them, and she closes it, and she smiles at the next person in the line. And then she goes home, and she opens the drawer in private, and she deals with what is in it. That is the system. That is what it costs. And that is why, when the camera caught what it caught, it was not a crack in Catherine's character. It was a crack in a wall that has been holding back an enormous amount of weight for an enormous amount of time. The weight, on this particular day, had a name, and the name was Charlotte. Charlotte Elizabeth Diana Wales is 11 years old, and she has been the most underestimated person in that family since the day she was born. She is the second child, which in a royal family means she occupies a particular kind of space. Not the heir, not the youngest, not the one with the clearly defined future, or the one with the most protection. The middle. And the middle, in a household running on schedules and protocol and the enormous machinery of public life, is often where the most observant child ends up. Because nobody is quite as focused on her as they are on George, and nobody is quite as worried about her as they occasionally are about Louise, and that leaves her with something that is rarer in that family than any title. She is left alone with her own eyes, and those eyes have been working for 11 years. People who have spent time around this family in private settings, and I mean genuinely private, not the arranged informality of a managed engagement, describe Charlotte in terms that do not quite match the public image. She is funny. She is precise. She notices the thing in the room that she was not supposed to notice, and then she watches to see whether anybody else noticed it too, and if they did not, she files it. She is, by multiple accounts, the child who asks the question that makes the adults in the room go slightly quiet. Not because she is difficult, because she is accurate. And for 11 years, Charlotte has been watching something that the adults around her have been working very hard to present in a particular way. She has been watching the relationship between her grandmother's memory and the woman who sits in the seat her grandmother never got to occupy. Diana died in 1997, 4 years before Charlotte's father married Catherine, 14 years before Charlotte was born. Charlotte has never met her. She knows her through photographs and through the way the adults around her talk about her, or more precisely, through the way they stop talking about her when certain other people enter the room. And Charlotte has been mapping those silences for years. She has been noting which name changes the temperature. She has been watching who goes quiet and who does not, and what that tells you about the thing nobody is saying directly. She has been building a picture without anybody handing her the pieces, and by the time she was 11, the picture was largely complete, and it was not the picture the palace would have chosen for her. The gathering happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, inside one of the smaller reception rooms at Windsor that the family uses for occasions that are too personal for a formal space and too significant for a kitchen table. It was not a state occasion. It was not on any public diary. It was the kind of afternoon that exists in that family a dozen times a year and that the outside world never hears about, which is precisely the kind of afternoon where the truth is most likely to come out. The adults present included Catherine, Camila, two of the senior household staff who have been with the family long enough to know when to become invisible, and at least one other senior family member whose name I am going to hold for now because the importance of where they were standing when Charlotte spoke is something I want to give you properly. Charlotte was there because the gathering fell on a day when the children were home from school, and the original plan had been for the children to be kept occupied in a separate part of the house. That plan adjusted, the way plans do in a household with 3 children and a complicated schedule, and Charlotte ended up in the room. She was not supposed to be. Now, the conversation that was happening in the room before Charlotte entered is important context, because what Charlotte said was not random. It was a response. And to understand what she was responding to, you have to understand the particular quality of the conversation she walked into. Camilla was speaking about a charitable initiative that she had been publicly associated with for several years. One of the patronages that sits under her name that she has appeared at events for, that the Palace Communications Office has attached to her public profile. She was speaking about it warmly, the way people speak about the things they feel genuinely represent them, and she said something in the course of that conversation, said it the way you say something when you are in a room with people you trust, without the particular care you apply when you suspect somebody is listening who might take it differently than you intend. She said that the work was something she had put her own mark on, that she had shaped it into what it now was, that it had become, in her words, something that feels like mine. Charlotte walked in approximately 40 seconds later, and nobody in the room, not Catherine, not the staff, not the senior family member standing near the window, moved quickly enough. Here is what Charlotte said. She was standing in the doorway, and she had clearly heard the tail end of the conversation, and she looked at Camilla with the specific expression that 11-year-olds deploy when they are about to say the thing the adults in the room are hoping they are not about to say. And she said it in the voice children use when they are not being rude, when they are genuinely asking, when the question is sincere, and the sincerity is the most devastating thing about it. She said, "But that was my grandmother's. She built all of that. Everyone knows that." 11 words. Read them again slowly, because the power of them is not in any single one. It is in the accumulation. But that was my grandmother's. She built all of that. Everyone knows that. The first part is a correction. The second part is an explanation of the correction. And the third part is the one that landed hardest in that room, because everyone knows that is not the language of a child being defiant. It is the language of a child who genuinely cannot understand why the correction is necessary. It implies that the true version is so widely understood, so obviously established, that the need to state it is itself bewildering. It says, "I am not telling you something new. I am telling you something you already know. And the fact that you were saying what you were saying tells me something about you." An 11-year-old did not calculate any of that. She just said what she believed to be true. But every adult in that room heard every layer of it simultaneously. Catherine heard her daughter describe her late mother-in-law's legacy, being quietly absorbed into another woman's identity, and find it so obviously wrong that she could not stay silent about it. That is what Catherine heard. She heard 11 years of her own careful navigation of that particular tension coming out of her daughter's mouth without any of the careful navigation attached to it. Camilla heard a child tell her, in front of witnesses, that what she had claimed as her own belonged to somebody else. She heard it stated as fact. She heard it stated as common knowledge. She heard it from an 11-year-old girl who had no idea she was being devastating and was therefore impossible to be angry with in any way that could be shown. The senior family member near the window heard it and did not move, did not intervene, did not smooth it over. Let it stand in the room for the full length of time it needed to stand there. And the household staff heard it, the way household staff hear everything in that building, which is to say they heard every word and will carry it for the rest of their working lives. And on this occasion, one of them eventually carried it a little further than Windsor. The hours between that room and the live broadcast are the part that most of the reporting on this story skipped past, because the broadcast itself was the visible thing, and visible things are what gets covered. But what happened inside that household in the intervening hours is where Catherine's breakdown actually began. Not in front of a camera, in a corridor, in a conversation with her husband that neither of them had planned to have that afternoon. William found out what had happened within the hour. That is not a guess. That is how that household operates. Nothing of that nature stays contained for longer than 60 minutes inside those walls, because the people who work there understand that their job is to manage information, and that managing it means making sure the right person has it before the wrong version of it reaches someone else first. He came to find Catherine, and she was already in the place she goes when she is holding something too large for the room she is in, which is to say she was occupied with something very small and very practical, reorganizing papers on a desk, adjusting something that did not need adjusting, the specific busyness of a person who is not busy at all. He asked her how she was, and she said she was fine. And he looked at her for a moment, and he said the thing that undid her. He did not say it to be unkind. He said it because it was true, and because William does not have the capacity for comfortable dishonesty with his wife, which is one of the things that makes their relationship work, and one of the things that on certain afternoons makes it very hard. He said she was not wrong, was she? 3 seconds of silence. Catherine put the papers down. No, she was not wrong. And what followed was not an argument, and it was not a breakdown, and it was not a confrontation. It was two people standing in a corridor acknowledging a truth that had been in the house with them for years, and that had just been said out loud for the first time by the last person either of them would have chosen for the job. Their daughter, who had no idea what she had done, who was at that moment in another room entirely asking someone when dinner was. Catherine had a live broadcast commitment that evening. It had been in the diary for weeks, a recorded appearance for a charitable initiative close to her, something she had agreed to and prepared for, and that 17 people had organized around. The question of whether to cancel it was raised once and dismissed almost immediately, not because the palace machinery does not accommodate cancellations, but because Catherine dismissed it herself. She was going. She had committed. She was going to sit in front of that camera, and she was going to say what she had prepared to say, and she was going to be fine. William looked at her when she said that, and he did not argue. He knew what fine meant in that house. He had grown up in a house where fine meant the opposite. The broadcast was not supposed to be emotional. That is the first thing to understand about what the country watched that evening. This was not an interview about family or legacy or anything adjacent to the territory Charlotte had walked into that afternoon. It was a segment about Catherine's charitable work, about a program she had championed for several years, about outcomes and funding, and the kind of good news story that a press office approves with relief because it is clean and warm and nobody is going to write anything difficult about it. She arrived composed. She sat down composed. She answered the first 4 questions composed, and the people watching at home, the royal correspondents with their notepads, the casual viewers who had tuned in for an unrelated reason and stayed. None of them had any reason to expect what was coming because there was nothing in the first 4 minutes that suggested it was coming. The 5th question was about legacy, specifically about what it means to build something that outlasts the moment you are in, that carries forward beyond the person who started it, that becomes bigger than any individual's contribution to it. A gentle, open question about the long view of charitable work. The kind of question that has a dozen safe answers and that an experienced royal can navigate in her sleep. Catherine began to answer it, and somewhere in the middle of the answer, something happened to her face. It was not a flinch. It was not a tremor. It was subtler than either of those, which is why it was more devastating than either of those would have been. It was the specific expression of a person who has just heard something in their own words that they were not expecting to hear, who has said a sentence out loud and in the saying of it has understood something that was sitting just below the surface of the thought. Her voice stayed even. Her hands stayed still, but her eyes changed. And then, about 3 seconds into the change, the eyes filled. She did not stop talking. That is the part that the camera could not look away from. She did not pause, did not reach for water, did not do any of the things a person does when they are preparing to compose themselves. She just kept going. The way you keep going when stopping would mean admitting to something you are not ready to admit to on camera in front of a country that has been watching you for 15 years. But the tears were there. Briefly, quietly, undeniably there. And then she pulled the wall back up. She finished the answer. She thanked the interviewer. She stood up at the end of the segment with exactly the correct expression. She did everything right, and the country had still seen it. The 3 seconds were already in the can, and they were going to be on the front page by midnight. The palace was informed before the broadcast finished airing. That is also not a guess. The machinery that exists around these moments is substantial, and it moves fast. And by the time the program's end credits were running, 3 senior communications officials had already seen the footage and were having a conversation nobody would enjoy having. Not because Catherine had done anything wrong. She had not. She had simply been human on camera, which in that institution is its own particular category of complication, because the institution runs on the fiction that the humans inside it are operating above the register where ordinary human things happen. Camilla's household received what I will call a notification rather than a briefing. The distinction matters because a briefing implies you are being given information to use. A notification implies you are being told something that you are expected to absorb quietly and not discuss. The notification, by multiple accounts, was received in silence. Camila herself heard about the broadcast that evening. And here is the detail that tells you everything about where she is in that household right now. She heard about it at roughly the same time as the general public. Not before. Not with any additional context or explanation. At the same time. Like someone who is no longer on the distribution list for the things that matter. She watched the footage. And according to people with knowledge of that evening, she watched it twice. What she said afterwards was said to a single person in a private room, and it has not been repeated in full. What has been repeated is the quality of the silence that preceded it. A long silence. The kind that comes after you have seen something you recognize but wished you had not. Charles was told by his private secretary. He received the information, asked 2 questions about Catherine's well-being, received answers that satisfied him, and then sat in his study for a period that the people who work around him described as longer than his usual processing time. He did not call William that night. He called him the following morning. The conversation was short, and what Charles said was kind, and he asked William to tell Catherine that he thought she had handled it with grace. William passed the message on. Catherine received it in the way you receive kindness when you are not sure you deserve it. Quietly, and without quite being able to let it all the way in. Anne heard about the broadcast and the footage and what had happened in the room earlier that same day within 24 hours. She was at a public engagement when she received the information, and she completed the engagement without any visible adjustment to her expression. Afterwards, in a private moment, she said something to a member of her staff that was repeated later, and that I want to give you in a moment, because it belongs at the end of this story rather than the middle. Inside the palace, the fallout was not explosive. Explosive would have been easier to manage. The fallout was the specific kind that this family generates at its worst, which is the kind that changes the temperature of every room it touches without anybody ever raising their voice in any of them. Conversations got shorter. Certain topics developed a new and careful avoidance. The household staff, who are expert readers of atmospheric pressure, adjusted their routes through the building in the way they do when the air between certain people has changed. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not irreversibly, but shifted in the way that certain things shift in a family when a child has said the true thing out loud and the adults can no longer pretend they did not hear it. Now I want to take you back to Charlotte, because the bombshell is not really the story. The bombshell is the surface. The story is underneath it, in the question of how an 11-year-old girl assembled the knowledge to deliver it. Because Charlotte did not guess. She did not stumble. She walked into a room and made a correction with the confidence of a person who has checked her sources, and her sources, her entire education on this particular subject, came from observation alone. Nobody sat Charlotte down and told her about Diana's legacy and what had happened to parts of it, and who had benefited from that and whether that was right or wrong. Nobody handed her the analysis. Nobody gave her the conclusion and asked her to agree with it. She built it herself. She built it from years of watching which photographs got prominent placement in which rooms and which ones were slightly further away than you would expect. She built it from years of noting how certain names changed the energy of a conversation in the way a shift in weather changes the feel of a room before any rain falls. She built it from the particular experience of growing up in a family where the most important woman who never arrived is present in every space she is absent from. If you know how to look, she knows how to look. People who have observed Charlotte in family settings over the last few years describe a child who has developed what one person called a very quiet radar for things that do not add up. She does not make a scene about them. She does not announce her conclusions. She files them the way her Aunt Anne files things, the way her father files things, with the patience of someone who understands that information has its proper time and that saying a true thing too early is the same as wasting it. But she is 11. And on this particular Tuesday afternoon, she walked into a room and heard something that landed on her as so straightforwardly incorrect that she corrected it before the patient part of her brain caught up with the honest part, and the honest part had been waiting a long time. What she said about Diana's legacy in that room was not the language of a child who had been coached or primed or pointed in a direction by a parent with an agenda. It was the language of a child who had watched adults do something for years and silently formed a view about whether it was right and never said so, and then suddenly said so. The adults who were present all understood the difference. That is part of why it landed so heavily, because coached outrage can be dismissed. Spontaneous accuracy cannot. Charlotte, for her part, understood almost immediately that she had done something significant, not because anyone told her, but because the room told her. Because the quality of the silence that followed her 11 words was a different quality to any silence she had produced before. She went quiet herself. She looked at her mother, and Catherine, to her enormous credit, did not perform a reaction at all. She did not rush to smooth it over. She did not correct Charlotte, or redirect her, or do any of the things the institution would have recommended. She held her daughter's gaze for a moment, and then she said very quietly that they would talk later. And Charlotte understood that the later was going to be significant. It was. Anne, I have been holding her back, and I told you at the start that I would give her to you properly, so here she is. Anne heard about Charlotte's 11 words and about the broadcast footage within a single day. She received both pieces of information in sequence, the room first and then the camera, and she processed them in the way Anne processes everything, which is in complete stillness, and with the specific quality of attention she gives to things that confirm what she has already privately concluded. She did not call Catherine. That is not how Anne operates. She does not reach for a phone when a gesture will do, and she does not make a gesture when a word will do, and she does not use a word when silence does the same work more efficiently. What she did instead was send a single written note to Kensington Palace, handwritten, which is the only kind Anne sends, short, which is the only length Anne uses for the things that matter most. The note said that Charlotte reminded her of somebody. That was it. No name, no elaboration, no explanation of who the somebody was, because the somebody did not need naming in a note sent from Anne to Catherine about an 11-year-old girl who had just stood in a room and told a truth that the adults around her had been managing for decades. Catherine read the note, and she did not show it to William immediately. She held it for a day, and then she put it in the place she puts the things she wants to keep. But there is one other thing Anne said, and this is the thing I told you I was holding for the end of the chapter. She said it in a corridor at Windsor 2 days after the broadcast, to a member of her staff who has worked with her long enough to understand when to remember something and when not to. On this occasion, they chose to remember it. Anne said that the interesting thing about that family was that you could spend 30 years trying to remove a woman from a building, and her granddaughter would walk back in and put her back in 30 seconds. She said it the way Anne says things, quietly, almost to herself, looking at something in the middle distance rather than at the person she was technically addressing, and then she walked on down the corridor and did not say another word about it. Here's where Camilla stands now. And I want to be precise about this because the temptation in a story like this is to overstate the ending, to hand you a dramatic conclusion when the reality is more unsettling than drama. Camilla has not been formally diminished. Nothing has been announced. No engagement has been publicly canceled. No statement has been issued. The machinery has not made an official noise. It never does in that family. The official machinery is the last thing to move, and it moves only after everything else has already settled into a new arrangement. But the arrangement has settled. The room where Charlotte spoke is not a room Camilla has been in since. That is not a coincidence. The distribution of information that reaches Camilla's household has a different shape to it now than it had 6 months ago. Smaller, more selective, arriving slightly later than it used to. These things are invisible to anyone outside the building and entirely legible to anyone inside it. And something else has happened that is harder to quantify, but more significant than any of the administrative adjustments. The protection that Camilla has always relied on in that household, not Charles's protection. That is different, but the institutional protection, the deference that accumulates around a person when the people around them have decided that managing her comfort is part of managing the institution. That protection has developed a quality it did not previously have. Hesitation. People who would previously have smoothed things over without being asked are now waiting to see whether smoothing is required. People who would have found gentle ways to redirect a difficult moment are now letting difficult moments stand a little longer before they intervene. It is not hostility. It is the specific withdrawal of automatic support. And automatic support, when it goes away, is the thing you did not know you were relying on until the moment you reach for it, and it is not there. Camilla built her position in that family on Charles's willingness to shelter her, and on the institution's willingness to extend her a professional courtesy she had not technically earned. She has the title. She has the residence. She has the formal apparatus of queenship. But the warmth that made the apparatus feel like home has cooled by several degrees. And an 11-year-old girl, standing in a doorway asking an honest question, is the reason it cooled. That is the thing about truth delivered without agenda. You cannot argue with it. You cannot manage it. You cannot put it back in the box it came out of. You can only live with the temperature of the room after it has been said. Catherine composed herself on camera that evening. She always does. But she is in the car now, on the way back from the broadcast, and she is looking out of the window at the city, moving past her in the dark. The driver knows the route. The protection officer in the front seat is watching the road. There is no one in the back seat asking anything of her, and for approximately 19 minutes between the studio and the palace gates, nobody needs her to be composed at all. She is thinking about her daughter. Not about the broadcast, not about the footage that is already on every front page, not about the conversations that are going to happen over the next 48 hours with people who manage these things for a living. She is thinking about an 11-year-old girl who walked into a room and said 11 words and had no idea she was doing anything except telling the truth. She is thinking about what it means that her daughter assembled that picture on her own, without help, without guidance, without anyone sitting her down and explaining the architecture of what had been done to the woman whose name she carries as her third name, Diana, Elizabeth, Diana, Charlotte, Elizabeth, Diana. She carries the name, and she figured out what it meant to carry it by watching, by noting, by filing things away with the patience of someone twice her age and the clarity of someone who has not yet learned to complicate what is simple. William was 15 when he understood what had been done to his mother. He learned it through a conversation, through a letter, through years of watching portraits come off walls, and flowers get burned, and rooms get locked. He learned it the long way, with all the damage that the long way does to a person, and he has carried that damage quietly for 30 years and built his entire public life partly around the discipline of not showing it. Charlotte learned it by watching adults claim things that belonged to someone else, and she was 11, and she just said so. In the car, Catherine puts her hand against the cold glass of the window. Diana would have done exactly the same thing. That is the thought Catherine is sitting with on the way home. Not the broadcast, not the politics, not the institutional consequences of a child saying the true thing in a room full of adults who had built careers around not saying it. Just that. Her daughter is 11 years old, and she walked into a room, and she told the truth without flinching, without calculating the cost, without doing any of the careful architecture that everyone around her has been building for decades to avoid doing exactly that. And Catherine broke on camera not because she was embarrassed, and not because she was angry, and not because she was frightened of what comes next. She broke because she recognized something. She was looking into a camera talking about legacy and what it means to build something that outlasts the person who started it. And somewhere in the middle of that sentence, she heard her daughter's 11 words underneath her own. And she understood that the legacy she was describing was not only the charitable work, and not only Diana's name on a wall, and not only the institutional memory of a woman who was never given her proper place in the building she helped define. The legacy was sitting at home in Windsor, asking someone when dinner was, getting strong again,